In 2015, the mountaineering world was shaken by a deep and puzzling mystery. Denali, the highest mountain in North America, has always been known for its towering grandeur and the extreme challenges it poses to anyone daring enough to climb it. But what happened when one of the most respected guides in the world vanished while leading an expedition on this treacherous mountain? This wasn't just an accident. The disappearance of a man with decades of experience, sharp skills, and a solid reputation in the global mountaineering community left everyone bewildered. Something was wrong, very wrong, and no one knew what it was. This guide, a seasoned mountaineer who had survived countless extreme conditions, wasn't just any expedition leader. He was seen as the key to success on any mission. Denali doesn't forgive mistakes, and any slip-up could mean death. With him in charge, the confidence was high because his peers knew nothing could catch him off guard. His experience made him practically immune to the unforeseen challenges that arise in the mountains, with an almost instinctive ability to read the mountain's conditions and react accordingly. So, when he disappeared, the mountaineering community didn't believe the explanation would be as simple as an accident or a judgment error. After all, this man had faced far harsher conditions in the past and still managed to lead successful expeditions. The expedition began like many others. The climbers were prepared for the grueling journey to the summit of Denali, a climb that demands extreme mental and physical endurance. The mountain, with its biting winds and freezing temperatures, is one of the most challenging on the planet, and those few who reach the top know it's not just about getting there, it's about surviving. In such a setting, even the most experienced can be caught off guard, but no one was expecting the guide to vanish without a trace. As soon as he disappeared, the atmosphere around the expedition shifted drastically. There were no clear signs that he was in immediate danger, and the weather conditions weren't extreme enough to justify a tragedy. He simply disappeared. Soon after his disappearance, the search was intensified. Helicopters flew over the massive slopes of the mountain, and rescue teams began combing every inch of the area where he was believed to have fallen or gotten lost. But despite all efforts, the search turned up nothing concrete. No sign of the guide was found. The few clues that emerged, like traces of climbing gear and fragments of his equipment, didn't help paint a clear picture of what had actually happened. The mountain, as always, kept its secrets hidden, and the disappearance became shrouded in an even deeper mystery. Meanwhile, the guide's wife, a woman who shared his life and understood the challenges of living alongside a mountaineer, was consumed by uncertainty. The weeks dragged on, and the pain of not knowing what truly happened to him began to gnaw at her mind. She knew he was a man more prepared than anyone, and that his ability to handle the unpredictable was unmatched. The question hanging in the air was simple, yet devastating. If he disappeared, what could have happened? The possibilities of an accident or a judgment error seemed unlikely. But what else could have led to this disappearance? The vastness and unpredictability of the mountain seemed to suggest a more complex explanation. But no one knew for sure what had occurred. As time passed, the mystery deepened. Theories began to surface. Some said he might have gotten lost during a moment of extreme exhaustion, or that he could have suffered some kind of physical failure, something that had never happened before. Others speculated that the guide might have taken his own life, unable to cope with the mountain's pressure or some personal issue in his life. But these explanations didn't seem to match the profile of the guide everyone knew. How could a man so prepared and experienced just vanish without a trace, without warning his companions, or showing signs of suffering? The atmosphere of mystery took over everyone, with speculation filling the void left by the lack of answers. While the guide's wife dealt with the anguish of loss without even being able to mourn, the entire mountaineering world tried to understand what had happened. Denali, as if it were a force of its own, held its answers tightly, while everyone tried to piece together an impossible puzzle. What had seemed like a simple disappearance was starting to reveal itself as something much bigger, something no one was prepared to understand. What was at stake wasn't just the life of a mountaineer. The search for answers was also a search for understanding, not just about what happened on that mountain, but about human nature in the face of adversity. Could it be that the circumstances on the mountain had hidden more than just the tragedy of an accident? Or was Denali a symbol of something deeper, something yet to come? The mountain had remained silent, but as always, it was about to reveal secrets far beyond imagination. The pain of losing a loved one is something we can all understand, but the pain of not knowing what happened, of having no explanation, is a suffering that seems to carry an even heavier weight. For the wife of the missing mountaineer in Denali, this pain was even more intense, as in addition to dealing with the loss, she was forced to face an absence of answers that consumed her. She, who had always known that risk was part of a mountaineer's life, never imagined that risk would become reality in such a brutal and mysterious way. Her husband, with whom she shared a life and a history of challenges overcome, had vanished without leaving any clues, without a clear explanation, and this created an insurmountable reality before her. In the early days after the disappearance, a sense of paralysis took over her. There was something impersonal and almost surreal about the search and rescue process. Rescue teams flew over Denali with helicopters, and mountaineering teams scoured the more remote slopes, but the lack of answers only intensified the feeling of despair. At first, she tried to stay strong, believing that over time, information would emerge, and that her husband would be found, alive or dead. But as the weeks passed and no concrete clues appeared, the emotional void and anguish took over her in an irreversible way. There would be no going back. There was no way to turn back time for one last conversation or to understand what had happened at that fateful moment. With growing frustration, she found herself forced to deal with the feeling of being lost, wandering through a maze of uncertainties. It was as if her world had distorted, and she was forced to search for answers in a place where they weren't to be found. The pain of not knowing what had happened became unbearable, as the human mind, when confronted with the unknown, tends to search for explanations, often in places where there are no easy solutions. She began questioning everything: the risks involved, the decisions made during the expedition, whether perhaps her husband had noticed something in Denali that she, as his wife, could never have imagined. The mountain had swallowed her husband, but it could not swallow her questions. It was at that point that the first theories started to emerge. Some people began suggesting that the disappearance could have been a suicide, a difficult idea to swallow, but one that resonated with some of those observing the situation from afar. After all, a mountaineer's life is filled with a series of emotional and psychological challenges. The constant risk, the stress of expeditions, and even personal tensions can create an enormous burden. But the guide's wife couldn't believe it. She knew him too well to accept this explanation. He had never shown signs of being in such an emotionally vulnerable state that he would make such a drastic decision. He was the type of man who faced difficulties head-on, without hesitation, and she believed he wasn't someone who would succumb to despair, no matter the circumstances. On the other hand, some voices close to the rescue circle suggested that the disappearance could have been the result of a judgment error, a misstep in decision-making that led the guide to get lost at a crucial moment. However, this theory didn't seem convincing to the wife either, who knew just how meticulous and careful he had always been. He not only had the necessary instincts to navigate the most challenging mountains, but he also had an incredible ability to anticipate risks and act preventively. It was unlikely that he would have made such a fatal mistake all of a sudden. And even if he had made a mistake, The absence of any concrete clues seemed to suggest that there was more to the story than just a simple accident. In the absence of clear answers, speculation took over the wife's mind. She began to wonder if her husband had found something in Denali, something that others hadn't seen, something that wasn't just related to the mountain's inherent risk, but something darker. Had he discovered something that forced him to make a difficult decision? Had he been confronted with a situation beyond what any mountaineer could imagine, and that's why he disappeared without a trace? These unanswered questions hammered relentlessly in her mind, creating an emotional whirlwind she didn't know how to control. But time passed, and the wife began to realize that her search for answers was not just about understanding what truly happened on that fateful day. The search for answers was also a way to cope with the pain, a way to keep her husband's memory alive. She found herself immersed in an emotional journey that went far beyond looking for evidence. She was, in fact, searching for the truth, for what really happened out there, in the vastness of the mountain. But without answers, the hole seemed to deepen. No theory seemed convincing enough to fill that void. And while she drowned in speculation, the outside world, in its insatiable quest for truth, also began to doubt what had happened. The impact of the guide's disappearance was profound, not only for his wife, but also for the mountaineering community. Everyone was lost amid uncertainties. The sense of helplessness in the face of the magnitude of what had happened was palpable. Yet the guide's wife was determined. She would not give up. The mountain that had taken her husband also held its secrets. Secrets she would do anything to uncover. She wouldn't rest until she understood what really happened on that expedition, until every clue was examined and every possibility considered. But what she still didn't know was that the answer was closer than she thought, and the road to the truth would be far more tortuous and complex than she could have ever predicted. The guide's disappearance was slowly becoming more than just a personal tragedy. It was transforming into a question that challenges the very essence of mountaineering and human exploration. The search for answers went beyond the desire to understand what had happened to one man. It became a quest for absolute truth, something that could transform everyone's perception of the mountain and their own fate. However, what the guide's wife didn't know was that this search, no matter how painful and agonizing it was just beginning. And the revelations to come could change everything. 7 years had passed since the disappearance of the Mountaineer in Denali. During this period, rescue efforts had been suspended, investigations had cooled down, and the case seemed to have been archived in the drawers of history, like so many other incidents on the icy, unforgiving mountains of Alaska. However, as with many situations, the truth, no matter how it hides, finds subtle ways of emerging. That's exactly what happened when, unexpectedly, a new and enigmatic clue was discovered. The discovery was made by a group of mountaineers who, while exploring a remote area of Denali, found a fragment of climbing gear abandoned in the middle of a large ice formation. As they got closer, they realized that the fragment belonged to the missing guide. Along with the gear, there was a backpack. Although the area had been previously searched by rescue teams, and despite the minimal chances of finding anything new, the backpack was quickly identified as his. The find was, in itself, an unexpected twist, as everything pointed to the fact that any trace of his body or belongings had been consumed by the ice or the mountain itself. But the real mystery lay in the contents of the backpack. When the mountaineers examined the items inside, what they found left them perplexed. Among the common personal items a mountaineer would carry with him, there was something that didn't make sense, something no one expected to find: an old, worn map, apparently of a remote and unexplored region of Denali. The map didn't seem to be associated with any of the known and documented expeditions. In addition, there was a metal ring, a seemingly simple object, but one that appeared to carry immense symbolic weight. The most enigmatic part was that the map seemed to indicate an area where, until that moment, rescue teams had never thought to search. This simple find raised a wave of speculations, but one thing was clear. The guide's disappearance and his possible death now seemed to be part of something much more complex. The impact of this discovery was immediate. The mountaineering world, which had already buried the memory of the guide, was quickly reignited. The map and the ring didn't make sense in relation to the original narrative of the case. No reasonable explanation emerged for what could have happened. The guide, as everyone knew, wasn't just an experienced mountaineer. He was also an extremely meticulous man, always planning his expeditions with almost obsessive precision. If he had been in an unknown area of Denali, and if he had found something so crucial, it would be impossible to believe he would have left these clues behind so simply. Something much deeper was involved, something being hidden by the mountain itself, by nature, or perhaps even by someone else. What intrigued most about the discovery of the map was the fact that it pointed to a location far off from the traditionally followed routes of expeditions that had attempted to climb Denali. This location had not been properly explored, suggesting that the guide, at some point, had made a radical decision and decided to investigate an unknown area of the mountain. Why would he do that? What could he have found in that region? And more importantly, what had happened to him after he got there? These questions sparked a new wave of speculation. The investigation was immediately reopened. Those responsible for the search found themselves confronted with the reality that what seemed like a simple disappearance was now taking a new direction. The idea of a simple accident or human error began to lose its strength, and new theories began to emerge. Could the guide have gotten lost in an unexplored area? Or was it possible that he had become involved in something even more unusual? Something that would be impossible for someone of his experience to foresee. Investigators, along with the guide's family, began to scrutinize the map carefully, trying to understand what it indicated. Some suggested that the guide might have made an important discovery, something no one else had noticed. A more intriguing theory was that he had found something that was being deliberately hidden, perhaps due to external interests like a geological discovery or even some clandestine activity on the mountain. The possibility that the guide had become involved in a conspiracy or even something related to illegal activities began to be considered. But as much as the new clues suggested a twist in the case, there were still many question marks. The metal ring found in the backpack also sparked a series of speculations. Who could have given him that ring? What could the meaning of such a simple object, but with such strong symbolism, be? The ring seemed to be the key to something bigger, but no one knew exactly what. As the investigation deepened, contradictions began to surface. Mountaineering experts started reviewing records of past expeditions, looking for any evidence that the guide had shown interest in this specific location of Denali. But, surprisingly, there was no mention of this isolated region in specialized literature, not even among the most experienced mountaineers. What did that mean? Had he been the only one to discover this location? And if so, what had motivated him to do so? The initial clue of the fragment of climbing gear and the backpack containing the map and the ring wasn't just an isolated find. They were a turning point that brought forth new theories, new possibilities, and a new line of investigation that challenged all the previous explanations of the disappearance. The idea that the guide had simply gotten lost or made some mistake became even harder to support. With each new discovery, the older theories were questioned, and new questions arose without answers. The revelation that the guide could have been in an unexplored area of Denali made the issue far more complex than it initially seemed. It was no longer just a simple disappearance on a treacherous mountain. Now the case was surrounded by a much larger enigma, a plot that involved more than just a mountaineer and his relationship with the mountain. Perhaps Denali wasn't just the setting for an accident, but the stage for something far more intricate and dangerous. Something that was yet to be discovered as the investigation deepened. The clue found in the ice rekindled the hope that the truth about what really happened to the guide might finally come to light. The mountain, which until then seemed to have guarded its secret with relentless silence, now began to reveal its first pieces of a much bigger puzzle. And the answers, once again, seemed within reach, but still far from being fully understood. The reopening of the investigation after the discovery of new traces of the missing mountaineers' equipment and belongings in Denali marked a crucial turning point in the mystery that had haunted the mountaineering community for over 7 years. The disappearance of the guide, once considered an inevitable tragedy, now seemed to have been just the tip of the iceberg, with layers of complexity hidden beneath the mountain's relentless silence. The search for the truth, fueled by the discovery of the backpack and the mysterious map, reignited hope that the case could be resolved, but at the same time, it intensified the doubts and questions. In the first days after the discovery, marked by a frenzy of speculation and theories, the investigation began to take a new direction. A new team was assembled, composed of experienced mountaineers, specialized investigators, and even some of the missing guide's closest friends and colleagues. These team members were not only driven by an investigative spirit, but also by strong emotional ties, as many of them had worked alongside the guide on past expeditions and had a deep trust in him. This created a collaborative environment, but also unspoken tensions, with each person trying, in their own way, to fill in the gaps of what had happened during that fateful expedition. The first major task for the new team was to carefully analyze the map found in the backpack. The object, seemingly simple, had been the key to triggering the renewed investigation. However, the true nature of the map was something no one expected. With signs of wear and age, the map appeared to have been drawn a long time ago. It indicated a remote area of Denali, a location that had been unknown until then and had not been mentioned in any official records or in previous expeditions. The fact that the guide, with years of experience, had possibly ventured into this area without recording any official signs raised several questions. Was this an unexplored area, or did he have some other reason for being there? The map seemed to be a clue to something bigger. But what exactly? The questions began to multiply. Had the guide, with his unique ability to assess risks and make decisions, ventured into a region of Denali that no other expedition had explored? Or perhaps more disturbingly, had he gone there for a reason that involved more than just climbing the peak? Why hadn't he communicated to anyone about this location? The guide was always extremely meticulous, documenting his expeditions in great detail and precision, leaving little room for doubt. So, the fact that he hadn't shared his intention to explore this area of the mountain seemed strange. Something was being hidden, and the map was the first indication that the disappearance was not as simple as it appeared. As the analysis of the map continued, other details began to be revisited. The team started to examine the records of all past expeditions on Denali, especially those in which the guide had participated. It was at this point that a second unsettling discovery was made. Some of the climbing routes the guide had followed seemed to have been riskier than usual, with some stopping points inconsistent with the typical mountain conditions. This indicated that he might have deviated from the usual route for some specific reason, perhaps to investigate something he deemed important. The idea that he might have acted on information that only he possessed became more and more plausible. This line of investigation led to a series of interviews with other mountaineers, survivors of past expeditions on Denali. These interviews proved essential in uncovering more about the guide's personality and behavior before his disappearance. Some of the interviewees reported that the guide had shown on previous occasions an unusual interest in less explored areas of the mountain. Although he had never directly spoken about his intentions, he was always attentive to details that others considered irrelevant. This behavior raised a disturbing hypothesis. Perhaps the guide had found something of vital importance in Denali, something that went beyond the simple pursuit of the summit. Additionally, other contradictory clues emerged. During the interviews, some mountaineers suggested that the guide had been seen in an altered emotional state before his last expedition, leading to speculations that he might have made an impulsive decision or done something that was out of his usual character. But these claims seemed inconsistent with the guide's personality, who had always been regarded as someone with great emotional and mental discipline. The idea that he could have made some kind of emotional or psychological error seemed absurd to those who knew him. If something had happened, it would have been something far greater than any personal failure. The tension between witness accounts began to grow. Some people supported the theory that the guide's disappearance was caused by a judgment error or a failure in his ability to read the mountain's conditions, but these ideas were increasingly debunked by new discoveries. Every new clue seemed to lead to more questions, and the investigation appeared to be going in circles. With each new interview, contradictions emerged, and with these contradictions, the case became even more murky. The search for the truth was more alive than ever, but it seemed to be slipping further away with every step taken. As the days passed, the investigation deepened in several directions. Some of the hypotheses initially raised were discarded, while others became stronger. The idea that the guide had become involved in something mysterious or unrelated to just climbing began to gain more traction. Perhaps he had found something in Denali, something that, for some reason, was being hidden by authorities or external groups. The theory of an important discovery, something that could have changed the course of mountaineering history, or even something involving economic or political interests, began to be explored further. With each new discovery, the case gained more substance. If before the idea of a simple accident seemed plausible, now the investigation seemed to be heading towards something far more complex. The idea of human error or judgment failure was being questioned, and the possibility of a secret discovery was gaining more weight. The guide, the experienced and reliable man, seemed to have become involved in something bigger than just a simple climb. Something on the mountain was being kept secret, and he perhaps was the key to unlocking that mystery. As more information emerged, the investigation gained a new urgency. What seemed to be a simple disappearance story was now unfolding into a narrative full of secrets, enigmas, and unexpected discoveries. The case still didn't have a clear solution, but one thing was becoming more and more evident. The truth about what really happened to the guide was further away than ever, and Denali, with its deep and treacherous mysteries, still held secrets that even the most experienced could not have imagined. The investigation continued to unfold new layers of complexity, especially with the emergence of key figures who, although not directly involved in the missing guide's expedition, possessed information and experiences that could help solve the mystery. These individuals, whose experiences with the guide and the mountain intertwined in peculiar ways, brought new elements to the plot while simultaneously deepening the suspicions and doubts. As each interview unfolded, the case gained more nuance, and the line between what seemed like the truth and what could be manipulation became increasingly thin. Among the mountaineers interviewed was a veteran of Denali expeditions, someone who had shared challenging journeys. Although the veteran had not participated directly in the last expedition, he had known the guide for a long time and had deep knowledge of his personality and behavior during critical moments. This mountaineer, with his vast experience, was the first to suggest that something had been different about the guide's attitude just before his disappearance. According to him, there was a palpable sense that the guide was carrying some sort of secret, something he didn't want to share with others. The veteran revealed that, during a recent conversation, the guide appeared uneasy, almost disturbed. Something in his demeanor seemed to indicate that he was dealing with something that wasn't related to the mountain, but was more profound, something he couldn't or didn't want to reveal. This behavior was unlike the guide, a man usually focused, calm, and rational in the face of the adversities the mountain imposed. For the veteran, this change was significant and couldn't be ignored. Perhaps the guide was involved in something that went beyond the simple act of climbing a mountain. He had a sense that the guide was immersed in some internal dilemma, a personal crisis, or more specifically, something tied to a discovery. But exactly what, he didn't know. These statements raised new hypotheses that began to take shape in discussions among the investigators. One of the most intriguing theories was that the guide, although always seeming like a serene and resolute man, might have been involved in a situation of risk or even betrayal. The idea that he could have discovered something in Denali, a discovery he didn't want to share with others, started to gain more traction. And, as expected, various assumptions emerged about what that secret might be. Some suggested that he might have found something related to valuable natural resources on the mountain, something that could attract external interests. Others pointed to the possibility that he had come across illegal activities, like poachers or clandestine explorers trying to exploit the region without the authorities' knowledge. Additionally, some interviews uncovered an even more unsettling piece of information. A mountaineer who had climbed with the guide on previous expeditions reported an incident that, although briefly mentioned at the time, now seemed more relevant than ever. During a previous expedition, the guide had acted strangely at a critical point in the climb. According to the report, the guide seemed agitated and, for a moment, showed apathy and indifference to the safety of the group. This episode, which had been briefly discussed and then ignored, was now being re-evaluated, and many began to wonder if this behavior was an indication that the guide was going through an emotional crisis, or if, somehow, he was feeling pressured by something they didn't fully understand. However, the guide's behavior before his last expedition was not just a matter of psychological analysis. Some of the most revealing interviews emerged when the investigation team focused on conversations with other members of the Denali expeditions, especially those who had been the guide's climbing companions during times of tension and extreme risk. One of these mountaineers, who had worked with the guide on various other mountains, suggested that on several occasions, the guide seemed to possess an unusual knowledge of certain areas of the mountain. This mountaineer spoke about how the guide always seemed to anticipate certain problems and situations that could arise during the climb, suggesting that he knew more than he should about the dangers of the mountain. It was as if he had a deep connection to the terrain, almost as if he had privileged knowledge about the mountain's conditions. This, combined with his strange behavior before the last expedition, made this mountaineer question whether the guide was, in fact, seeking more than just scaling the peak. These interviews with mountaineers, many of which pointed to a notable shift in the guide's behavior, opened up a new line of investigation. The central question now was, what did the guide know or find in Denali that made him act so strangely? Was he simply dealing with the weight of a traumatic experience, or was something deeper, darker involved? The answers to these questions continued to elude, but suspicions were far from being dispelled. In fact, what once seemed like a simple mountain tragedy was revealing itself to be a multi-layered drama of intrigue and manipulation. However, not everyone was convinced that the guide had become involved in something dangerous or suspicious. Some of the mountaineers closest to him continued to defend that he was just an ordinary man, trying to handle the normal challenges of an extreme expedition. For these mountaineers, the more complex theories were simply speculations that strayed too far from reality. They insisted that, although the guide might have been disturbed at some point, it didn't mean he was involved in anything illegal or improper. To them, the guide had always been someone with solid principles, someone who knew how to handle the risks of the mountain and would never make an impulsive decision without understanding the consequences. The clash between these different perspectives brought an uncomfortable truth to the surface. The contradictions in witness testimonies and evidence were creating a reality where everyone seemed to doubt each other's integrity. The guide's wife, still clinging to the idea that her husband had been the victim of an accident or an unfortunate situation, began to question the credibility of some of the mountaineer's reports, especially those suggesting he was involved in something more complex. The pain and suffering of the loss mixed with the growing distrust, and she found herself being pulled in many directions, not knowing who to trust or what to believe. These suspicions fueled the mystery of the disappearance even further. If, on one hand, the investigation suggested that the guide could have been the victim of unforeseen and difficult-to-control circumstances, on the other hand, the possibility that he had been involved in something deeper and more dangerous could not be ruled out. The confrontation of versions and hypotheses not only expanded the case, but also weakened the certainties that had, until then, guided the investigation. The guide now was not just a missing mountaineer. He had become a central figure in a psychological and emotional drama where the line between what was real and what was speculation was becoming increasingly blurred. And as new pieces of the puzzle emerged, the investigation became an increasingly difficult maze to navigate. As the investigation deepened, revelations emerged that completely changed the course of the case. The disappearance of the Mountaineer in Denali, which initially seemed to be an isolated tragedy, was now transforming into a much more complex and enigmatic drama. The new discoveries made in the days following the reopening of the investigation, including the map, the ring, and the fragment of equipment, brought to light possibilities no one had considered before. The guide, far from being an innocent victim of an accident, seemed to have become involved in something much bigger, something carefully hidden by the mountain or perhaps by someone else. What had seemed like a simple disappearance was now being challenged by a more complex narrative, where truths began to emerge in fragmented and contradictory ways. One of the most revealing moments in the investigation came when, after days of interviews and re-examination of evidence, a mountaineer who had been part of the expedition was confronted with questions he hadn't expected. This mountaineer, who had initially been cooperative, began to show evasiveness as the investigation progressed. He was one of the first to be questioned when the evidence began to pile up, and it was during this phase that the first major confrontation occurred. At first, the mountaineer seemed to give in easily to the questions. He spoke about the guide's experience and the safety of the routes they had taken. He described the expedition as just another routine climb, with no major complications. However, when the investigators began to question him about the guide's behavior in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, the mountaineer's stance changed. He started evading the answers, avoiding the more incisive questions, and giving vague, generic responses. This alone raised suspicions. Why was he being so evasive? Why couldn't he recall crucial details? The guide, with all his experience and competence, was not the type of person who would make hasty choices. So, what could have happened during that expedition that made some members of the team act so strangely when asked about the details? It was at that moment that the mountaineer began to hesitate. During the confrontation, he reluctantly revealed that the guide had spoken about something during the expedition, something about a discovery. He vaguely mentioned a thing in the ice, but refused to provide further details, claiming the guide had said that the discovery should remain a secret. This seemingly innocent comment sparked a flame in the heart of the investigation. Could the guide have made an important discovery before disappearing? If so, what exactly had he found in Denali? And more importantly, why did this mountaineer feel so uncomfortable talking about it? It seemed like he was hiding something crucial, something he knew but didn't want to reveal. As the investigation team tried to extract more information about what really happened during the expedition, more contradictory reports began to surface. Other mountaineers who had climbed with the guide on previous occasions began to speak up, and what began to emerge was a picture of a man who was obsessed with something more than just the climb. The guide was not just someone aiming for the summit of Denali. He seemed to be seeking something else, something no one else had considered. Several of the mountaineers closest to him began reporting incidents where the guide appeared very focused on specific points of the mountain, areas that had not been explored or properly documented until then. These revelations began to suggest that the guide might have discovered something deep within Denali, something so significant that he chose not to share it with others, perhaps out of fear or a desire to protect the discovery. The discovery of an old map and a mysterious ring in the guide's backpack now seemed to make more sense. These items could have been connected to a bigger search, something the guide didn't want others to know about, but had possibly found. He had mentioned something about a thing in the ice, something that could be related to a buried secret in the mountain. This secret could be geological, archaeological, or even something far more complex, involving external interests. But what this secret was remained a mystery. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, tensions between the members of the expedition increased. During the confrontation with investigators, another mountaineer started to question the guide's reasons for straying from the traditional route and exploring unexplored areas of the mountain. This mountaineer suggested that the guide seemed to have a growing obsession with this remote region of Denali. He recalled conversations where the guide mentioned a secret discovery and showed a peculiar interest in exploring this area. The mountaineer didn't know exactly what the guide was searching for, but he was certain there was something more involved, something that made the guide act differently, something that set him apart from his colleagues. These revelations began to create a scenario where the disappearance of the guide could no longer be attributed to a simple misjudgment or an unforeseen accident. Instead, everything pointed to the fact that the guide had become involved in something more. The new clues suggested that he had found something on the mountain that was of vital importance, something he felt needed to be kept secret. What had he found? That was still to be discovered. The map found in the backpack, the mysterious ring, and the mountaineer's reports began to give substance to the theory that the guide had been involved in something more than just a mountain expedition. He seemed to have come across something so significant that it led him to make unimaginable decisions. The climax of the investigation came when the atmosphere of distrust and tension between the mountaineers and the investigative team reached its peak. Some members of the expedition began to feel uncomfortable with the questions asked by the investigators. Accusations surfaced that some mountaineers were trying to hide information about the guide's behavior before his disappearance. As the questions became more incisive, the answers became more evasive. The confrontation between the investigators and the mountaineers was a crucial turning point in the investigation, revealing that the suspicions about the guide and his possible discovery were more grounded than anyone had imagined. It was during these confrontations that the true motivations of some characters began to emerge. Some mountaineers were clearly trying to protect the guide's legacy, while others were more concerned about the possibility that he had become involved in something that could tarnish his reputation. The emotional complexity of the investigation, combined with the weight of guilt and suspicions, made each interview more tense and full of nuances. The revelations made during these confrontations began to paint a more complete picture of the guide, but at the same time, they complicated the search for the truth even further. What had seemed like a simple disappearance was now turning into a drama of discoveries, secrets, and betrayals, with each new confrontation bringing up more questions than answers. The mountain, always silent, continued to guard its answers. But the price of the truth was becoming more evident with each passing moment. After weeks of investigation and discoveries, the case of the missing mountaineer was nearing its climax. The search for answers seemed to be at a standstill, with pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together, but no clear picture of what had really happened.
Sense of urgency. Experts, survivors from previous expeditions, and the guide's family joined forces to...
They knew that what awaited them on Denali would not only be a physical risk, but also a psychological one. They would need to overcome their own doubts, fears, and insecurities. Each step toward the summit would be an attempt to unveil the mountain's secrets, while the extreme conditions tested their limits. The idea that the guide might still be alive, or that he had left some kind of crucial clue, made the mission even more agonizing. But what was at stake was not just physical survival. It was a confrontation with the past, with the mystery that had stretched on for so long. The atmosphere was thick, almost palpable, as the expedition drew closer to the remote areas of Denali. The towering icy mountains, which had been the scene of the guide's disappearance, now seemed to watch from afar, guarding their deepest secrets. As the investigators moved forward, they began to realize that the truth was farther away than they had ever imagined. Each new clue seemed to open a new abyss, a new winding path, leading them deeper into the mountain and farther from the reality they had believed to know. It was when the investigators reached an extremely isolated and hard-to-reach area that the final twist occurred. At the bottom of a glacial crevice, they discovered something unexpected. The guide's body, partially preserved by the ice, but in conditions that suggested he had not died immediately after his disappearance. Contrary to what everyone had assumed, the guide might have survived for much longer than expected. The ice, which had initially been seen as the villain that consumed the truth, now seemed to preserve the evidence, keeping the last part of his story intact. The guide, apparently, had made a bold and desperate decision to try to survive, possibly after finding something in Denali that forced him to stray from the expedition. The body showed signs of immense physical effort, from someone who had been fighting for survival long after what everyone thought was his end. This raised a series of new questions. What had the guide found on the mountain? What had led him to act this way? Did he know that something was about to happen, or was he simply trying to survive something he couldn't control? But the climax wasn't just in the discovery of the body. It was in the revelation of what the guide had found before his death, evidence that changed everything. In a secret compartment of the backpack, a journal was found with notes indicating that the guide had discovered something much bigger and more important than anyone could have imagined. The journal detailed not only his doubts and concerns, but also a series of clues about an area of Denali being explored by unauthorized groups. The guide had come across these illegal activities, possibly involving natural resource exploitation, and knew that the mountain held something valuable. He had an idea of what was going on, and at some point must have decided to investigate further, but ended up straying from the main expedition to avoid being discovered. This journal revealed that the guide, far from being a victim of Denali's unforgiving environment, had become a key player in a much larger mystery. He knew what was at stake. He knew the risks he was running. But by making this discovery, he found himself torn between the desire to protect others and the fear of the repercussions of his own findings. It was a moral and existential struggle, a fight for the truth that manifested even more complexly in the notes of the journal. The guide was not just trying to climb Denali, he was trying to make a discovery that could change the course of everything. This revelation was the turning point. The guide hadn't disappeared by accident, but because of a decision driven by something much bigger, something no one could have anticipated. When the journal was read, it became clear that the guide's disappearance wasn't a simple mountain tragedy. but a story of risk, survival, and sacrifice. He had strayed from the expedition to investigate the illegal activities occurring in Denali, activities he believed were destructive. He hadn't just gotten lost. He had been part of a bigger story, and this story needed to be told. The climax of the expedition wasn't just the discovery of the body, but the understanding that the guide had become involved with something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. He was no longer seen as a man who had failed in his expedition, but as someone who had sacrificed himself to understand a truth that was being carefully hidden by the mountain and possibly by other interests. The true nature of his death, and what he had really found in Denali, was finally revealed. The impact of this discovery was profound. The mountain, which had seemed to hide everything for so long, was now giving up its secrets, but at a price. The investigators, who had once been searching only for answers about a simple disappearance, now found themselves faced with a story that challenged everything they knew about mountaineering, human nature, and the limits of truth. The guide's death became the apex not only of his own journey, but of an investigation that, in the end, defied expectations and revealed a reality much more complex than anyone could have imagined. What had once seemed like an accident now became a tale of struggle, discovery, and sacrifice. The guide, whose story had been shrouded in mystery for so many years, now became a historical figure, not for his death, but for the courage with which he faced the secrets that Denali held. His journey, full of uncertainties and twists, finally reached its climax, and with it, the truth began to emerge. The discovery of the guide's body and the journal he had left behind finally brought closure to the mystery surrounding his disappearance. However, what seemed like the end of the search for the truth also revealed a much darker reality, filled with injustices and unresolved issues. The guide's death had not just been the end of a life, but also the culmination of a larger story that touched on illegal exploitation, corruption, and the fight for nature preservation. The truth had finally emerged, but justice still seemed like a long and winding road. What the journal revealed was much more than a simple explanation of the guide's disappearance. He had found something far greater in Denali than anyone could have imagined. During his final expedition, he discovered that Denali was being used for illegal activities. The guide was not only attempting to reach the summit of the mountain, but he also stumbled upon a network of natural resource exploitation operating in the shadows, away from the eyes of the government and the proper authorities. These clandestine activities were not only destroying the region, but posed a direct threat to the integrity of Denali's natural environment. When the guide decided to investigate this network on his own, perhaps hoping to gather evidence, he strayed from the main expedition, taking on risks far greater than anyone could have imagined. But in doing so, he also stepped away from the help he so desperately needed when things began to go wrong. The first reaction after the discovery of the body and the reading of the journal was a sense of justice, but that feeling was quickly diluted by frustration. The guide, in his search for the truth, had paid the highest price: his life. The truth was now in plain sight, but the answers that could lead to justice were much more complex. The big question that arose was, who was behind these illegal activities? Who benefited from the exploitation of resources in one of the most protected mountains in the world? The guide had been a hero, a man willing to face everything in the name of justice, but the pain of knowing that he was up against forces much larger than he could control was still hard to process. On one hand, the discovery was a triumph. Those responsible for the illegal exploitation and the conditions that led to the guide's death now had their responsibility laid bare. But justice, as always, proved harder to attain than it seemed at first. The interests behind the exploitation of Denali were vast, involving powerful companies and even government agents who had turned a blind eye to what was happening in the mountain's remote areas. The truth that the guide had sacrificed himself to expose these activities, which threatened Denali's ecosystem, brought a new level of awareness, but also highlighted the harshness of the system against which he had fought until his last breath. The guide's wife, who had suffered for years without answers about her husband's death, found some comfort in the truth, but not in the form of justice she had longed for. For her, the pain of understanding what had really happened, of grasping her husband's sacrifice, brought a kind of relief, but also a sense of helplessness. She had known that her husband was involved in something important, something that required courage, but now she knew that he had been a victim of a much larger, darker, and more relentless system than she could have ever imagined. The justice she yearned for could not bring her husband back, but the truth about what he had faced and why he made the decisions he did offered some emotional closure. Justice for the guide, however, was not just about finding those responsible for his death, but about shedding light on the network of corruption and exploitation he had tried to expose. The journal and the discoveries made by the investigators sparked a broader movement of awareness and investigation. Public pressure, fueled by the pain and the fight for truth, began to rise. But, as always, the road to justice was slow. The government, for instance, was slow to take significant action. Investigations into the illegal activities in Denali dragged on, with authorities trying to downplay the importance of the discovery and the evidence often being buried or disregarded in favor of economic and political interests. But the guide's sacrifice was not in vain. Though justice seemed slow and uncertain, the revelation of what he had found and what he was trying to expose initiated a movement for environmental preservation and stricter oversight in Denali. The guide's fight, though tragic, led to change. His sacrifice became a symbol of resistance against the rampant exploitation of nature. The truth about his discoveries, painful as it was, gave voice to a larger cause, one that sought to protect what remained of the mountain and the wild regions of Denali. However, not everyone was willing to accept the new revelations gladly. Resistance, both from the government and certain corporate groups, was strong. There were many financial interests behind the illegal activities uncovered by the guide, and these groups were unwilling to let a man, dead for so long, undermine years of exploitation. This led to a legal and political impasse that further delayed any concrete action. At the same time, public support for the guide's cause grew, and more people joined the fight for Denali's preservation and justice. The guide's death would not be forgotten, his fight would be remembered, and over time, it might lead to more significant changes. Still, the concept of justice remained fluid and difficult to define. For the guide's family, justice was not just about seeing those responsible for his death punished, but ensuring that his death had some lasting meaning. And over time, it became clear that while those responsible for the illegal activities were still being investigated, true justice would come through preservation and education, ensuring that Denali was treated with the respect it deserved, far from the uncontrolled exploitation the guide had fought against. The guide's death, then, became not just a loss, but a catalyst for a larger movement, a movement for nature preservation and environmental justice. Finally, the sense of justice began to materialize. The case of the missing guide in Denali, with all its twists and complexities, not only brought the truth to light but also fueled a cause that would continue to fight for nature and the rights of those who seek to defend it. Though the guide did not survive to see the change he inspired, his death became a turning point in the battle for Denali's preservation. What had seemed like the end now revealed itself as the beginning of something bigger, something that, over time, would be recognized as the true victory. The resolution of the case of the missing mountaineer brought a mixture of relief and sadness. After years of uncertainty and pain, the wife and the investigators were finally able to understand the true story behind the guide's disappearance. Although the truth had been revealed and justice was slowly being pursued, the emotional wounds could not be healed simply or quickly. The revelation that the guide had died while attempting to expose an illegal exploitation network in Denali brought forth a reflection on the costs of seeking the truth and the sacrifices made in the name of justice. For the guide's wife, the resolution brought a sense of relief, but also renewed pain. She had known that something wasn't right, but the answers she finally found weren't what she had expected. Her husband, far from being the victim of a simple mountain tragedy, had become involved in something much bigger, something dangerous and immense, and had paid with his life for it. While she felt proud of his sacrifice, the weight of her loss could never be fully softened. The guide was no longer just a man lost in the mountains. He had become a martyr, someone who gave his own life to protect the mountain and the secrets it held. This truth, although finally understood, didn't bring immediate comfort. She understood that her husband had been courageous, but the emptiness left by his absence was deep, and the fact that he had died under such solitary and tragic circumstances made any attempt at closure difficult. The revelation also sparked a reflection on what justice really means. For the guide's wife, the truth that emerged wasn't enough to fill the void left by the loss. The search for justice seemed a long and difficult road, with many obstacles still to overcome. The discovery that the guide had found illegal activities taking place in Denali, and that he had strayed from the main expedition to investigate something so large and dangerous, brought a sense of victory, but also a sense of helplessness. Justice couldn't be achieved instantly. There were too many forces at play, and the system, as always, was trying to protect those involved in the illicit practices. The government and other authorities were not eager to act quickly, and this made the sense of justice often feel like an empty promise. Still, there was a small but significant consolation. The guide, with his courage and determination, had done what no other mountaineer would have done. He was willing to risk everything to uncover the truth, and his death would not be in vain. Justice, although slow and uncertain, was beginning to take shape. The revelation of illegal activities in Denali opened the door to deeper investigations, and public pressure on the authorities grew as more information was shared. The guide's struggle had given rise to a movement in defense of Denali's preservation and environmental justice, which brought some comfort to his wife. While she could never bring him back, she knew that he had fought for nature and for a cause greater than his own life. For the investigators who worked on the case, the resolution brought a new understanding of the cost of truth. They had started the investigation aiming to resolve a simple disappearance, but over time they found themselves facing a network of corruption and illegal activities involving not only mountaineers, but also companies and even government officials. The discovery that the guide had been a hero, attempting to expose this network on one of the world's most iconic mountains, made the investigators begin to see the mountain in a different way. Denali, once just one of the largest and most challenging mountains in the world, now represented so much more. It symbolized the fight for justice, resistance against exploitation, and the courage of someone willing to face greater dangers to ensure Denali's secrets were revealed. For the investigators, the case became a lesson on how the truth can be distorted, and how often the pursuit of justice requires a much greater sacrifice than one can imagine. As the case wound down, mountaineers and other colleagues of the guide began reflecting on the legacy he had left behind. To them, the guide would not be remembered only as someone who disappeared in Denali, but as someone who challenged the system to protect nature and ensure the mountain's preservation. His death transformed into a symbol of resistance. of someone who refused to turn a blind eye to what was happening. They knew that, without his sacrifice, Denali's secrets would likely never have been exposed. He had given his life to a mission few would have had the courage to accept, and that was worthy of respect and admiration. The mountain, with its grandeur and unforgiving beauty, became a silent memorial to the guide. He had dedicated his life to mountaineering, facing challenges and overcoming obstacles, but he never imagined his greatest battle would be against those who sought to destroy the very heart of nature. The mountain, which had always been a symbol of strength and resistance, now carried with it the memory of a man who faced the greatest dangers in the world to reveal the truth. Although the story reached a conclusion, it left an important lesson for all. The truth often doesn't come easily. It is hidden by lies, manipulation, and forces seeking to protect greater interests. But the fight for truth is necessary, and it demands courage, patience, and, at times, deep sacrifices. The guide, in his search for justice, reminded us that, although the truth may be difficult to reach, it is always valuable. His journey was not in vain, as his death inspired a change that would be felt by many long after. The truth he uncovered and the price he paid for it would never be forgotten, and his memory would continue to inspire future generations to fight for justice and preserve the nature he so dearly loved. Ultimately, the guide became a figure of reverence, not just for his skill on the mountains, but for his courage in fighting for what was right, for a fairer and more sustainable world. His story, full of pain and sacrifice, became a reflection on the price we pay for what truly matters.